FARO Club. Punto di riferimento per le aziende della manifattura italiana di eccellenza che acquistano materie prime e metalli non ferrosi. Dal 1989 si confronta sui mercati finanziari in un contesto economico globale, studiando l'impatto che l'innovazione può avere sulla domanda delle materie prime. Siamo un networking di brand dell'eccellenza italiana, a disposizione per un percorso formativo. I nostri orizzonti sono rivolti al futuro per cogliere nuove opportunità di business, per entrare in contatto con i decisori aziendali in cornici esclusive. Sviluppa una nuova visione sui mercati e si confronta con economisti, analisti e imprenditori visionari. FARO illumina il pensiero dominante, escludendo i rumori di fondo. Fornisce analisi finanziarie consolidate e un continuo confronto con idee visionarie proiettate al futuro. La nostra ricetta è un mix di informazioni attendibili, buona governance e money management. Assicuriamo l'azienda e gli stakeholder da rischi di volatilità dei mercati finanziari. Proteggiamo l'azienda per trasmetterla alle generazioni future.
So hello everyone, my name's Samad Ham. For those of you who are not familiar with LMC Automotive, we're an information provider that forecasts vehicle sales, production and powertrain. And I have a lot to talk about today. So these are all topics requested by FARO members. And the main theme of this presentation is how will the transition to zero emissions vehicles develop over time. But in order to understand that, it's firstly useful to look at recent trends. And to put some perspective on those trends, global BEV sales, battery electric vehicle sales, were up 27% in 2020, while the global car market was down 15%. That's all despite the poor car market and a cut in incentives compared to 2019 in some markets. And despite cheap gasoline, and despite the fact that the BEV market is still in its infancy with regards to infrastructure and model choice and technology. From a sales standpoint, 2.1 million BEVs were sold last year compared with 1.7 million in 2019. The total market lost 12 million compared to 2019, while the BEV market gained 400,000 sales. So overall, a pretty impressive result. But in reality, that's mostly due to the success in Europe, being encouraged by boosted incentives and the 2020 fleet average CO2 imperative. There was a deluge of new plug-in models available in 2020, and there was a lot of OEM marketing activity in pushing these vehicles. So overall, Europe's BEV and total markets went in opposite directions and at different speeds. BEV sales grew by 375,000 to 730 in financial year 2020. Meanwhile, in China, the 2019 subsidy cut plus COVID plus the general economic slowdown saw BEV sales decline until mid-year, when the government shored up incentives to protect the NEV market in the face of the pandemic. And as a result of that, Chinese NEV sales are now getting back on track. And in the US, with no new incentives and no special stimulus, the electrified market has more or less followed light vehicle sales overall. Main takeaway from all of this is just, it shows how much of an effect that policy continues to have on the BEV market. And on the incentive and subsidies areas of policy in Europe, what the pandemic did was legitimize additional spending on subsidies, where previously it would have been much more difficult to justify and pass legislation through national parliaments. there's definitely been the sentiment in Europe that if governments are to support the struggling auto industry, it should be focused on a so-called green recovery. And certainly if you look at the BEV share in individual markets in Europe, unsurprisingly, the ones with the highest share are the ones with the strongest incentives. Looking at a monthly view, the BEV segment reached almost 6% of global passenger vehicle and North America light truck sales. December was a particularly crazy month as consumers took advantage of boosted incentives before they were withdrawn. And in Europe, although it's difficult to prove, the data indicates that there's been a lot of pulling forward of sales from early 2021 into December and pre-registration of vehicles. And that's most likely because the manufacturers need to meet their fleet average CO2 target for last year. And Tesla, of course, loads its deliveries to the end of every quarter. But we should be a little cautious about expecting this level of growth level of share to continue in the short term, but the trend is clear. It seems to be accelerating. Okay, so looking ahead, here's our long-term view of the plug-in market globally. This is battery electric and plug-in hybrid. And starting with Europe for the first time since the start of China's NEV boom, in the first half of last year at least, Europe briefly took the lead in plug-in sales. And our initial analysis showed that Europe will retain its position even until 2030. In the short term, these boosted incentives will be rolled back, there's no doubt about that, but the regulatory imperative will keep the momentum. But core countries like Germany, UK and France are expected to phase out pure ICE and hybrid vehicles by 2035. Others will be later. There will be stragglers, especially in Eastern and Southern Europe, and some will be sooner, such as Norway and the Netherlands. And as for China, subsidies were cut by 20% from January 2020, but have now been extended to 2022, albeit with further reductions. Although we don't believe, in our opinion, that subsidies have as much of an effect in China as they did in the past. The China plug-in market is heavily determined by government policy and targets, and less so by free market economics. So that's why it makes it so difficult to predict, especially because government policy can and does change literally overnight. And to that end, in the light of that's the so-called what they call Technical Roadmap 2, published late last year, which is a sort of white paper setting out a roadmap for the future of the automotive industry in China. And it's a component part of China's so-called 5-year plan. And it sets much higher targets for BEV and hybrid in 2025 and 2030, with a view to phase out pure ICE by 2035. So in light of that, we are likely to add more volume to China in the mid and long-term outlook for battery electric vehicles and full hybrid vehicles, but not plug-in hybrid, which we plan to reduce post 2022. With that in mind, it would put China ahead of Europe once again. And as for the USA, the midterm outlook is also subject to an upward revision if the Biden administration policies can be enacted in time. President Biden says the environment is #1 priority after COVID and will readopt the Obama era policies as soon as possible. The US is rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. Federal EV tax credits have been extended also. And more states and more OEMs were already on board with this sort of attitude, even during the Trump era, in defiance of more lax federal CO2 targets. So we will likely make an uptick to the USA outlook for our next quarterly update as well. However, the environment for BEVs in the US is very different to Europe and China, especially in terms of ingrained consumer attitudes, charging infrastructure, range concerns, and general political uncertainty. So for that reason, we have to be cautious about the prospects for mass EV adoption in the US anytime soon. And finally, a global scenario for electrified vehicles to 2050. This is our base case taken from our global hybrid and EV forecast. And our standard forecast horizon only goes to 2032. So I have to emphasize that anything beyond that can only be an educated guess. The major replacement for pure ICE vehicles will be 48-volt mild hybrid and full hybrid. Those two stem from two different powertrain philosophies, and OEMs are increasingly taking the full hybrid route, even in Europe, for which reasons where I'll explain later, but the major reason is because of future legislation, especially in European markets, that's talking about mandating some electric-only driving ability, which full hybrids are capable of, while mild hybrids, even in their future evolution, are limited in that ability. Our view of plug-in hybrid is rather conservative. We believe it's a transitionary technology and will start to become obsolete as BEV energy density increases and costs come down. And that's already started to happen in some cases. And in Europe, while they have been a useful tool to meet CO2 targets in Europe, it's been our view for some time that the additional scrutiny, public scrutiny on their real-world emissions will cause local policymakers to remove incentives, and that's already started to happen. And in China, the government's latest roadmap puts a lot less emphasis on plug-in hybrid vehicles. But one scenario in which they might experience a resurgence, or at least be kept alive, is if bans are put in place on non-plug-in vehicles in future. Even by then, there will be a portion of drivers, consumers, that see BEVs as lacking the utility and the convenience. So we'll go for plug-in hybrids that meet their needs. As for ICE vehicles, pure ICE vehicles, by 2035, Europe and China will have very few pure ICE only sales. But keep in mind that there will be stragglers around the world, many developing markets that have little to no emissions legislation, have no reason to pursue rapid electrification besides the wider non-binding climate change commitments. And it also has to be emphasized that even when BEVs reach cost parity with ICE vehicles, those developing markets lack and will continue to lack the infrastructure to support mass BEV adoption. But globally, BEVs are of course going to be the most important technology, and we see a figure of 22% globally by 2032. But the regional picture varies greatly, as I showed in the previous slide. And our position on hydrogen fuel cell vehicles is that current policies and investment do not support them in this decade, but the environment to make them viable will be very different in the next decade, where we see them as a key solution alongside battery electric vehicles. We believe that's the end game. And just talking about fuel cells further, and yes, OEMs and suppliers have been pushing fuel cells for over a decade, but nothing really changes, as you can see by the size of the market today. And with the best will in the world, they can't really do anything until the infrastructure is established, and that has to be done mostly by governments. Tesla was a driving force in the popularity of BEVs because they got into charging stations early on. We don't see that happening to a sufficient extent with OEMs for hydrogen infrastructure, or at least not by themselves. Rolling out electrical charging points is relatively easy. It's a whole different ballgame in terms of both cost and complexity, with hydrogen fueling stations, hydrogen storage, and hydrogen synthesis plants. And the fuel cells vehicles are themselves very brilliant, and fuel cell technology is relatively mature. They do have a very high purchase cost, but that's only because of the small size of the market. They do have precious metals in the fuel cell stacks, but way less compared to BEVs, and they are being reduced over time with further research. For the time being, though, it seems the world has decided BEVs are the answer. But in our view, BEVs cannot be the only solution for the long term. We have concerns over sustainability of battery production. There will eventually be a point where hydrogen is a solution to other problems outside of the auto industry, such as energy storage. It has other uses besides propulsion. So to that end, we do expect a resurgence of fuel cells from around 2035, where it could coincide with a renewable energy infrastructure that is sufficiently developed to facilitate a holistic hydrogen economy, meaning there will be enough renewable energy available to create hydrogen cleanly, and in turn hydrogen can be used for energy storage to solve the problem of intermittency of renewable energy. Of course, batteries can also do that job, but battery materials are a finite resource, and fuel cells can be a way to avoid the need for a vast and potentially damaging battery production industry. There's also concerns about overall life cycle efficiency of fuel cell vehicles compared to BEVs, but that shouldn't really be a major concern. It's kind of missing the point. In the meantime, current circumstances only make fuel cells viable in a defined environment in fleet operation, and fuel cells have a density advantage and therefore a payload capacity advantage over BEVs. So for that reason, in the meantime, there's more for potential in commercial vehicles. We think that Japan and Korea is where most of the fuel cell market is going to be concentrated, although our forecast is below the targets that these countries have, much for the same reasons as Europe. And in fact, for 2020, the actual sales have been much lower than the targets these two countries have set for this year. There is also potential in China. They have the resources to implement it, and there have been indications from the Chinese government that they want to provide support for fuel cells, but so far it's been limited to local trials. And just an interesting point to make, we're often asked, when will peak global IC engine production be? That is, vehicles both pure ICE and hybrids equipped with an IC engine. Our pre-COVID analysis showed that peak ICE would happen around 2025 globally, but because of now more subdued macroeconomic outlook as a result of the pandemic, it's obvious now peak ICE has already happened back in 2017, although there will be another soft peak around 2027. Okay, now just moving on to battery production and technology. We have a battery database and forecasts attached to our vehicle and powertrain forecasts. And perhaps the most useful trend we can extract from that, and one that we're asked about often, is the battery capacity demand. So this shows the global light vehicle battery requirement in gigawatt hours annually and cumulatively. It's across all hybrid and EV types and all battery chemistries, but it excludes pure ICE. So this doesn't include the 12-volt lead acid batteries. And this is production based. So these batteries are to be fitted to vehicles produced in Europe in grey and the rest of the world in green. So adding all that up, it's around 1.3 terawatt hours annually by 2032, just under half of which will be from Europe. And naturally, BEVs, battery electric vehicles, account for most of that. And Europe is a particular point of interest because there will be more demand for European-built batteries to keep costs down. So just by way of estimation, if we assume all of that 600 gigawatt hours for Europe by 2032 are to be sourced from plants within Europe, and that each of these plants has an average output of 24 gigawatt hours, that equates to around 25 European so-called gigafactories by 2032. And that's not such a huge endeavor, considering the fact that there are currently 60 active IC engine plants in Europe, and many of those can and are being converted to battery plants. And China dominates the lithium-ion supply chain, having quickly surpassed Japan and Korea, were the leaders for years. But Europe is on the rise now. And in terms of large-scale plants, we are aware of around 14 major projects in action, in development, or just being planned in Europe. But more are expected, and it could be around 20 active by 2026. And that would be an average cost of about 1.5 billion euros per plant. And Europe could be self-sufficient pretty quickly. If we were to add up all of these planned capacities and make some educated assumptions, estimations for the unknowns, by 2022 it could reach 120 gigawatt hours, and that would match the demand from European-built vehicles in 2022. And moving on from battery production to battery technology, specifically BEV batteries, which is very important to consider, because if you pose the question, what is stopping the average consumer from buying a BEV now? It's usually pragmatic concerns, whether it's the cost of the car or the range anxiety or the time it takes to charge it. And putting aside charging infrastructure for a second, it's battery technology, specifically battery energy density and power density is the main determinant of these attributes. I've chosen this curve of weighted average battery capacity because it serves to illustrate these three phases of development as we see it. At the moment, we're in a phase where rapid advances are being made in lithium-ion technology. Charging times are coming down, E-ranges are increasing, battery packs are being upgraded very often, and most of the recent advances come from manipulating the relative quantities of battery materials, such as cobalt, manganese, nickel, and aluminium in the cathode. And now there are efficiencies being made in pack design and management, such as cell-to-pack technology. This optimization phase will carry on until around the mid-2020s, where we expect we'll start to see ever diminishing gains, and any further advances will be small as we start to hit physical limits in conventional lithium-ion. Beyond this stage, we see the opportunity for mass commercialization of technologies beyond lithium-ion. That could include solid-state batteries with much higher energy density. But I don't think we should rely too much on the prospect of solid-state batteries, because firstly, although they have an energy density advantage, their sort of Achilles heel is power density, and therefore charging time will not necessarily be faster than current batteries, worse potentially. And secondly, if solid-state batteries are commercialized, and most battery experts expect them no earlier than 2030, then they won't be necessarily compatible with the tooling and manufacturing processes of conventional lithium-ion plants. So initially, they will likely be limited to niche applications. But what is certain is that these near-term advancements, such as new anode and cathode materials, better pack design and manufacturing, those are what are going to be bringing mainstream batteries below the $100 per kilowatt-hour mark. And speaking of which, as we know, the battery is the major reason for the high cost of BEVs. And for us as forecasters, it's critical to understand the likely price development because there is a close relationship to vehicle demand. The biggest driver or contributor to falling battery costs will be reductions in manufacturing costs through economies of scale and improved manufacturing processes. And of course, as I mentioned previously, adopting lower cost anode and cathode compositions and improvements in battery energy density, that's going to reduce material costs. So for our curve here, we try to take a sort of industry consensus, but actually we closely follow Bloomberg New Energy's outlook. And our around 2023 is where the $100 per kilowatt hour mark is expected to be reached on average, where BEVs are at cost parity with their ICE counterparts. But that doesn't necessarily mean they will be as profitable as their ICE counterparts for volume reasons. But again, that depends on also on the segment. For instance, premium BEVs will reach profitability sooner than mass market ones, and some already have. It also depends on the OEM. Some companies are not able to secure the same prices that, say, Volkswagen has. It depends on the vehicle platform and the design, whether the battery needs extra cooling. It depends on the battery chemistry. In some cases, LFP batteries have already reached below the $100 mark last year. So the curve you see here actually represents a sort of industry average. But also, it's likely that despite falling manufacturing costs, OEMs could take some years to pass on the savings to the consumer until they can recoup the huge investments they put in. We're often asked that what will be the cathode chemistry of the future. And for those of you who are in the metals business could be interested in this, this is again extracted from our battery database. NMC is the dominant type now, as it's the best all-rounder for range, and it's pretty versatile in that you can manipulate the relative quantities of nickel, manganese, and cobalt to get the characteristics you want. That green section of NCA is now pretty much all of Tesla. There's not much indication that other manufacturers will use it in the future. And for LFP batteries, up until 2019, the share of LFP batteries suffered a collapse as more advanced NMC chemistries like NMC 811 came onto the market, bringing with them longer ranges. But those high nickel, low cobalt ratios were more susceptible to instability and fires. And all it took was a couple of high-profile fires in China, and now there is a correction back to LFP batteries in China. And it started as a reaction to the NMC fires, but actually it's also because LFP batteries are much cheaper and the energy density gap is improving. There's new cells available that are pushing around 210 watt-hours per kilogram. And there's been some pretty substantial advancements in LFP technology, like cell-to-pack as well. And LFP batteries are also now going to be fitted en masse in Europe as well. For example, Volkswagen, Renault, and Tesla, some notable mentions. They're going to be intended for the sort of low-cost base specifications of models, while the NMC can be the main offering. And there is also the imperative to remove cobalt from batteries for cost reasons, not just because of ethical concerns. So that's what's fueling the search for cobalt-free batteries like LFP, and things like LNMO, lithium nickel manganese oxide, which is what we are calling, what we were assuming Tesla and the Chinese company Asphalt are developing based on their announcements. So what you see here is not a completely certain forecast. It's based on what we know of corporate decisions today, with some assumptions added for the future. And the situation is very fluid. But we think NMC is still going to be the dominant type for the next few years. But if things like LNMO and advanced LFP really take off, it could eat further into its share. Okay, so that was BEVs. But a big question remains on the IC engine. What will the future IC engine look like if it's to survive into the long term? And the gasoline engine is the main focus. There's an unprecedented amount of research and development being done now on gasoline technology, especially on plugging the gap in fuel efficiency between gasoline and diesel. But the main point is that gasoline can really only survive in the long term in hybridized form, not just because of CO2 targets and taxation, but also the looming threat of bans on pure ICE vehicles in many countries. And here there are two main paths, two philosophies for gasoline fuel efficiency in hybridized form. The European OEMs prefer downsized turbocharged engines. They favor 48-volt mild hybridization, and the future evolution of that is with the e-motor integrated into the transmission. The Japanese approach, on the other hand, is slightly larger, naturally aspirated engines that extract the fuel efficiency from other means, from a high compression ratio. And they couple that with a dedicated hybrid transmission in a full hybrid setup. And that is not to say that the one on the left is the way all European OEMs are going. This merely originated as a European approach, because in fact some of them are going towards the Japanese way. For example, Renault with their E-Tech powertrain, and even Volkswagen in the future. And also Chinese OEMs now, a lot of them are looking at full hybrids because full hybrids are now favorable in government regulations. And many OEMs are increasingly admitting that the fact that there are huge investments in battery electric vehicles mean that their ICE, the traditional IC engine offering will in future will have to be much more simplified and cut back. Powertrain options and specifications available to consumers will be limited. Number of engine and transmission families will need to be cut. The great thing about the Japanese full hybrid DHT approach is that everything is simplified. You have one, maybe two engine sizes for compact and large cars, and the mechanics of the system also cuts down on components and the complexity. But it begs the question, if you only have one engine, one hybrid system for most of your models, that's great in terms of simplicity and economies of scale, but then what are you going to do with your existing small engines that you've put so much research and development into? And let's not forget that the DHT full hybrid is not for everyone. It's a different driving experience, and consumer acceptance is still an open question. So that's another reason why many European OEMs are also going down the full hybrid, the 48-volt mild hybrid route to prolong their conventional turbocharged engines. And then there are other OEMs that say, well, we'll go BEV only in the next decade anyway. So what's the point of spending so much money developing an all new full hybrid powertrain, even if that's the best route? We can easily just slap on a 48-volt motor on our existing engines in the meantime. And that's certainly the approach taken by the premium manufacturers. But it could be a big gamble to do that for the sort of mainstream mass market OEMs. Euro 7 could threaten to make that approach unsustainable, especially in the segments where the profit margins are already thin, long before they can reach a BEV only product offering. Okay, and then there was a question around diesel. We see a continued downward trend in Western Europe passenger vehicle diesel. There's no surprises there. But volumes will stabilize in the medium term as the market volume recovers. Also, the monthly data shows that the decline was really slowing last year, which is, an indication at least that diesel is still needed for CO2 compliance, and mild hybrid diesel is another thing keeping it alive. Globally, light vehicle diesel recovers this year and next year, but still with a downward trend. But it's important to remember this sort of trend is diluted by a very strong diesel light commercial vehicle segment. Looking further out for Western Europe, though, we will see a more dramatic volume fall from the middle of the decade. This coincides with many OEMs making moves to exit the diesel market, and that time is when a lot of high volume small and medium cars are due for renewal. And also by that time, the new diesel engine families launched in the last couple of years would have run their course. So OEMs will be faced with a choice of either upgrading their diesel engines for Euro 7, whatever that might involve, or doing away with diesel in their passenger cars altogether. By the end of this forecast horizon, diesel will be confined to only the largest vehicles, where there isn't a viable alternative, especially for long distance drivers. But we believe it will virtually die out in Europe by 2035 and sooner in certain markets within Europe. But again, there is still hope for diesel in the light commercial vehicle segment. There will certainly be growth of BEV in small commercial vehicles, small vans, but less of an impact on medium to large vans and pickups. And there's been a lot of talk about how diesel is going to be killed by Euro 7 and the conformity factor for real dynamic emissions test being abolished. From what we've seen anyway, the current Euro 6 and D vehicles are already extremely clean and capable of reaching conformity factor 1 with the current hardware and calibration. And many OEMs were already targeting conformity factor 1 as a sort of just in case scenario as far back as 2015, post Dieselgate. And also the accuracy and the repeatability of the portable emissions kits has improved since then. And as for Euro 7, from what we can tell from the European Commission's latest impact assessment on the 3 options they are considering for Euro 7, it would impact gasoline as much as diesel. So for example, there's proposals for stricter limits on particulate number and measuring smaller sub 23 nanometer particles for gasoline. As for the sort of levers, the options available to OEMs to enact if necessary, it would depend on the OEM, but these seem to be the most common technologies and configurations being researched. For those in the metals business, the good news, it will likely mean more platinum group metals loading on the aftertreatment, larger brick sizes, among other things. Could all of this added cost kill off certain diesel engine families? Yes, but truth be told, there's several high-profile examples of that already happening. Okay, I'll leave this summary slide for you to read in your own time, and thank you for listening.